All right, so ready to dive into some English pronunciation tips?
Always up for a pronunciation deep dive.
This time we're focusing on tips for Spanish speakers.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we found the Spanish language podcast,
Okay.
and it's packed with advice. And I gotta say, even I learned a few things.
I'm not surprised. There are always new tricks to discover. What kind of stuff stood out to you?
Well, they used a lot of familiar examples, like to teach nationalities and pronouns. They use people like Maradona or Michael Jackson, Penelope Cruz, names everybody knows.
Makes sense, right? It's
Right.
way easier to learn something new when you can connect it to something you already know.
Totally. Like building a bridge instead of starting from scratch.
Exactly.
Speaking of bridges, let's talk about the I sound.
Oh, yeah.
They had a whole bit about how Spanish speakers sometimes pronounce I more like you.
I see. It's a pretty common thing. Spanish vowels are different beasts.
Makes sense. You got to retrain your brain and in your mouth.
For sure.
They also got into the R and T sounds.
Those are big ones. Huge, even. Mastering those can really change how natural your English sounds.
It's all about tongue placement, airflow, everything.
Exactly.
Right.
It's wild how different they are between Spanish and English.
Right. And they even suggested for the T to think about how it often sounds like a soft R in English, like in I'm going to. It kind of blends together.
It's that smooth linking of sounds that can be tricky.
And while we're on tricky sounds, what about long I versus short I?
Oh, yeah, that one. They had a really neat trick for that. They said to think of the short I, almost like an E sound.
It sounds strange, but it makes a big difference.
Huge.
Like bring versus drink. The vowel length changes everything.
Absolutely. That's a major stumbling block for a lot of English learners.
Right. It surprised me how important it is. But they were also really big on listening, even more than speaking, especially when you're starting out, like a 5.1 ratio, they said.
Wow, 5 times listening for every 1 time speaking.
That's what they suggested.
It makes you realize how crucial it is to train your ear to really hear the nuances.
Like laying the foundation before you start building the house.
Exactly.
And speaking of fun ways to practice, they were all about tongue twisters, especially she sells seashells.
Classic. Gotta love tongue twisters.
They're like a workout for your mouth.
Seriously. Like doing pronunciation reps at the gym.
But okay, this is the part I thought was hilarious. They suggested mastering the English L sound by imagining an English speaker saying Manuel, Miguel, and Raquel.
You're kidding.
I swear, I know, it sounds crazy, right?
It does, but honestly, it's kind of brilliant. It's about auditory imagery.
Like you're hearing it in your head, so your brain starts connecting the dots.
Exactly. It's like creating a sonic blueprint for your tongue.
So we've talked I sound, R and T, long and short vowels, tongue twisters. It's a lot to unpack, but there's one thing that really stuck with me, this idea of key letters in pronunciation.
Key letters.
Yeah. The podcast host kept mentioning them, but didn't really explain what they were. It was like they were hinting at a secret code to English pronunciation.
It definitely sounds like something worth exploring further. It's like they're giving us a treasure map, and it's up to us to go digging for the treasure.
I like the way you think. But yeah, they definitely left us wanting more on that key letters point. But moving on to another pronunciation hurdle they tackled, they had some really interesting advice about the R sound, specifically how it differs from the Spanish R.
It's one of those sounds that can really trip up Spanish speakers because it's formed so differently in the mouth. In Spanish, the R is much more of a rolling sound, often made by tapping the tongue against the roof of the mouth.
Right, whereas in English, the R is more of a gliding sound made by shaping the tongue towards the back of the mouth without actually touching it.
Precisely. It's much less about a distinct tap and more about creating the right shape in your mouth to let the air flow through.
And that's where that tired tip comes in handy, right? The one where they said to think of pronouncing tired like a mispronounced taller. It seems like a silly trick, but it actually kind of works.
It does, because it forces you to shift away from that rolling R sound and towards the more gliding English R.
And it highlights something crucial about language learning sometimes. A bit of playfulness and even silliness can be really effective. It's about breaking down those mental barriers and allowing yourself to experiment with new sounds.
Absolutely. Learning a new language is all about stepping outside of your comfort zone and embracing the awkwardness that comes with trying something new.
And sometimes the sillier the trick, the more memorable it is, which means it's more likely to stick with you.
Exactly. It's like that old saying, the best way to learn something is to teach it. Well, sometimes the best way to learn something is to make a fool of yourself trying.
So true. It takes the pressure off of being perfect and allows you to just have fun with the process. But Speaking of having fun with the process, I was really intrigued by how much emphasis they put on listening to English as a crucial part of improving pronunciation.
It makes perfect sense, though, right? You can't expect to pronounce something correctly if you don't first have a clear understanding of how it's supposed to sound.
It's like trying to draw a picture without ever having seen what the object looks like.
Precisely. Listening provides the visual, or rather, the auditory blueprint for your pronunciation.
And the more you expose yourself to the rhythm and flow of English, the more natural it will become for you to replicate those sounds.
Exactly. It's about training your ear to become more attuned to the nuances of the language.
And that's where that 5.1 ratio comes in. Remember, they recommended listening to English 5 times as much as you speak it, especially in the beginning stages of learning.
It's a fantastic strategy because it allows you to absorb the sounds of the language passively without the pressure of having to produce them yourself.
Exactly. It's like osmosis for your ears. But speaking of active practice, they also suggested a really interesting method for tackling the English L sound, the Manuel Miguel Raquel technique.
Yes. It's a bit unorthodox, but it speaks to the power of auditory imagery in language learning.
So for our listeners who may have missed it, could you elaborate on that technique a bit more?
Sure. Essentially, it involves imagining an English speaker pronouncing those 3 names, Manuel, Miguel, and Raquel, with a clear, natural-sounding English L.
It sounds strange when you say it out loud, but there's a method to the madness, right?
Absolutely. The idea is that by creating this strong auditory image in your mind, you're essentially training your brain to associate the correct pronunciation with those specific words. It's like planting a seed in your subconscious and letting it grow.
That's a really cool way to think about it. It's like you're creating a mental shortcut for your tongue to follow.
Precisely. And the more you practice this technique, the more automatic that pronunciation becomes. It's like building muscle memory, but for your tongue.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. But there's one thing that keeps coming back to me. The key letters idea. They didn't really elaborate on it. But I feel like it's something our listeners could really benefit from. What do you think?
I agree. I think it's worth unpacking a bit further because it might hold the key to understanding English pronunciation on a deeper level.
It's like they gave us a glimpse behind the curtain but didn't quite reveal the whole trick.
Exactly. But even a glimpse can spark some serious curiosity.
For sure. And that's what we're all about here, right? Digging deeper, exploring those little mysteries.
Absolutely. Because sometimes those little mysteries hold the key to unlocking a whole new level of understanding.
Okay, so let's see if we can shed some light on this key letters mystery. I'm thinking back to what they said about specific sounds and how they can trip up Spanish speakers.
Right, like the I sound, the R and T sounds.
Exactly. What if these key letters are like the foundation of English pronunciation?
That's an interesting thought. Like, if you can master the pronunciation of these key letters, it creates a ripple effect, making it easier to pronounce other words correctly.
And maybe it's not just about individual letters, but about the way those letters combine to create different sounds.
Right. It's about understanding the patterns and the rules that govern how sounds are formed in English.
Because once you understand the rules, you can start to see the logic behind the language, which makes it a lot less intimidating.
Exactly. It's like cracking the code. And that's what's so exciting about language learning. It's a constant process of discovery and decoding.
So for our listeners who are ready to embark on their own decoding adventures, what would you say is a good starting point?
Well, I think a great place to start is by paying close attention to the sounds of English. Really listen to how native speakers pronounce those key letters we've been discussing.
And don't be afraid to experiment. Try mimicking those sounds, even if it feels a little silly at first.
Exactly. Remember, there's no such thing as perfect pronunciation, especially when you're first starting out. It's all about progress, not perfection.
And the more you practice, the more those sounds will become second nature.
Absolutely. It's like learning any new skill. The more you do it, the easier it becomes.
It's like riding a bike, except with your tongue.
Exactly. So keep practicing, keep experimenting, and most importantly, keep having fun with it.
That's the key, right? Because when you're enjoying the process, learning a new language doesn't feel like a chore. It feels like an adventure.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this pronunciation adventure. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's a whole world of English pronunciation waiting to be explored.
And we encourage you to go out there and explore it. Listen closely, practice diligently, and most importantly, have fun.
And who knows, maybe you'll even discover some of your own key letters along the way. Until next time, happy learning, everyone.